Thanks so much, Mike. And I want to, before I even begin, I just want to extend a thanks to you for opening up this venue. You know, I put out a message on Facebook. I said, to all my Milwaukee peeps, I got something I want to share. Is there anyone that can provide a venue for me? And Mike, without any hesitation, in fact, I think I hardly had the message up for a minute, and I already had a response. And I said, okay, this is where we're going to do it then. And Mike has always been diligent like that. You know, as he mentioned, we go back. We actually went to UWM together for a while. And then as a reporter, as a crime reporter, I remember Mike being in the streets whenever something like this, the tragedy that we're about to discuss today, Mike was always calling attention to some of the underlying issues and trying to resolve the situation, whether it might be a gun buyback program or rallies to help those who have been affected by it. So Mike, thank you for all that you do, and thank you for opening up this place. All right, so we're here today to talk about the gun that was used to claim one of our young warriors. And I don't use that term lightly, but as you'll see, Sandra Parks was a warrior, and she was cut down in a war that's been going on for quite some time. So we want to start actually with her words, not with anything I had to say, but with her words. She said, quote, "We are in a state of chaos. In the city in which I live, I hear and see examples of chaos almost every day. Little children are victims of senseless gun violence." And this is from an essay called Our Truth that she wrote some 2 years ago. And this essay won third place in Milwaukee's Martin Luther King essay contest back in 2017. And this is a picture I found of her when she was being honored for this particular essay. I'll blow it up. You can see that's her in the center as she was being honored for her award-winning essay. And so nearly 2 years after she won that honor, as we all know, tragically, she was hit by a stray bullet fired outside of her home. And this case made not only local news, but this made international news. The BBC, CNN, the Daily Mail, and I can tell you this, in Washington, D.C., where I live, when I tell people that I'm working on this case, I want to find out about the gun that was used to kill Sandra Parks. When I say that in D.C., everyone has heard about this. I haven't gone anywhere where someone hasn't heard about this case, and they remember her by name and they remember the circumstances. So the reason I bring that up is because sometimes when these things happen in Milwaukee, right, and we know that she joins a long list of young children, innocents, who were hit by stray gunfire, as you can see from the photograph there, many of them young black girls. When something like that happens, sometimes we tend to look at things just from kind of a local perspective, but what we want to do today is show how this is actually the result of things that are taking place on a national level and even an international level. And we'll get more into exactly how. It's actually blown my mind the extent to which things that happen in Serbia or the state of Vermont can somehow manifest themselves and claim the lives of young children here in Milwaukee. And we'll see that as we get a little deeper into the presentation. So if there's one takeaway I want you to have from this, one of them would be that Sandra's death was very much a part of things that are taking place on a global scale, on an international level, right? And this type of thing continues, as you know. A few months after Sandra's death, there was a three-year-old girl here by the name of Brooklyn Harris who got killed in a case of road rage not long after her third birthday. And so these types of cases continue, but we have to kind of ask ourselves, what's driving it? What are some of the forces behind it? All right. So one of the things that one of the cases one aspect of the case I plan to make today is that Sandra Parks was killed because of political hypocrisy at the national level and economic greed at the international level. And you might not have ever thought about anything in Milwaukee being a result of something like that, but we'll see that that's the case. So the gun that was used in Sandra's case was described as an AK-47. And so as a reporter, back when I was a reporter at the Milwaukee Sentinel, and I would hear there was a particular case and they say, so-and-so was killed by an AK-47. I would always ask myself, where did that gun come from? How did an AK-47, right, end up on the streets of Milwaukee? Because this is a gun that's designed for war. So I'll take you back to 1996, which is the first time I looked into where a particular AK-47 came from. You might remember a girl by the name of Laquan Moore. She was also 13, same age as Sandra. So she was standing on the porch on Milwaukee's north side. I want to say close to 27th and Wright or Clark, somewhere in that vicinity. And that's her picture there. She's the girl in the center. And so this took place on June 25th, 1996. 3 young men in the car. They were in pursuit of someone they had a fight with. When they spotted that person, one of the men fired an assault rifle out the car the window. The shot missed the person that he was aiming at, but ended up hitting 2 young girls. One's name was Shalonda Young, the other is Laquan Moore. The bullet actually went through Laquan and then struck her friend LaShonda. Laquan died as a result of her injuries. Shalonda was seriously wounded. So in that case, there was an AK-47 that was used. And I wanted to know, okay, what's the history of this gun? What is the story behind this gun? Because every gun has a story to tell. That's the reason they have serial numbers on guns. And so I filed an open records request. Again, this is 1996. So we're talking 20-something years ago. It turns out that this was a Chinese-made Norinco sporter rifle, and it was purchased at a local gun store by a white, I'm bringing up race for a reason. He was a 2-time felon, and he was able to purchase the weapon because at that particular time, there was no background check required for long guns. So this is, different provisions of the Brady Act are just being implemented. The interesting thing is that this individual, Robert Madden, who wasn't even supposed to have a gun in the first place, when he saw the gun in TV news coverage for the court proceedings for Laquan, had the nerve to call the police and say, hey, that's my gun. He wanted it back. Now, that might seem kind of strange, but white privilege make you do things like that. And that's not the only case where this happened. So he called the police twice to report that that weapon was his. And so that ended up being the story that I wrote about that particular gun. He claimed that he lost the gun when he was, quote unquote, showing it to some people. My theory is that he was probably trying to sell it and got robbed. Whatever the case, he wasn't supposed to have the gun in the first place. The interesting thing is that even after that story made front page news, and we asked, well, how come Mr. Madden wasn't prosecuted? The DA said, well, we referred the case to the feds, and the feds said, well, we never got that message, and he ended up going scot-free. So here's a person who, if he had not bought the weapon, right, a young girl would not have been killed. She would still be with us today, but he was never held accountable for that. So anytime there's an AK-47, I hope that everyone in the room, when you read AK-47 in a news story in Milwaukee, start to ask the question, where did it come from? How did it end up in the streets of Milwaukee? In the 2000s, right, you might remember a controversial program called the GRIP program. Who remembers that? All right, it was an initiative by Sheriff Clark called the Gun Reduction Interdiction Program, right? And the idea was, let's go to certain parts of the inner city and we'll set up deputies to conduct these traffic stops, and we're gonna ask people to search their car. And I don't know if anyone has been stopped by the police, but there's ask and then there's ask. And sometimes when you're in certain situations, you don't feel like you're necessarily being asked, but being told. In any event, so this was a program that basically targeted young black men in the inner city. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But there was a lot of controversy about, was this a constitutional program? Is this, depriving people of their rights? I was the one who said, okay, why don't we look at the guns that are being confiscated through this program and see exactly where they're coming from. So it turns out that the first gun seized through the GRIP program was actually from a white citizen in Ozaukee County who was selling the gun on the streets of Milwaukee, got robbed while selling the gun. This has all been, I've already reported this. Got robbed while selling the gun and had the nerve, once again, just like the other individual, called Sheriff Clark, said, I got robbed. White privilege is something else. So what happens after he reports this? Sheriff Clark, the ATF, they set up a bust, not for the white individuals who are selling guns. They want to get the black individual who robbed the white person who was selling the gun. This has already been reported. I wrote this story when I was at the Journal Sentinel. And in fact, so the interesting thing was it was only after I did a jailhouse interview with, his name was Frederick Jones, the person who robbed the Ozaukee County men. And he was saying, why am I in jail, but they're not in jail? After that interview is when the Ozaukee County men, police finally raided their home, and that was like months after the case had taken place. My theory is just that, those jailhouse interviews are monitored. So it would be, you'd be naive to think that there wasn't some type of connection. And again, this is a story I wrote, if you want to see, that basically recounts that whole thing. The headline is Sheriff Clark's Roots in Controversy Run Deep. So I recount the two cases there in that particular article. But the interesting thing is these are two cases where white men who illegally bought or sold guns felt comfortable enough to call law enforcement when they were robbed of the guns on the street, even though they weren't supposed to be dealing with them at that particular case. So you might ask, well, why did I decide to look at the case of Sandra Parks? Is it because of that? Yeah, that's part of it, because I'm wondering, okay, this particular AK-47, yeah, it ended up in the hands of a convicted felon, but the question is how? Who gave it to him? Who sold it to him? But there's some other reasons that I decided to look into this particular case. So one of them, and some of it is quite personal, right? So she wrote an essay that won a contest, but I wrote an essay that won a contest when I was 17. And in fact, it was that essay that led me to become a crime reporter. But what struck me was when I read Sandra's essay, it was so similar to mine. We were talking about the same things, that I came to see Sandra as a future journalist, just like I wrote the essay and went on to become a journalist because of it. I saw Sandra in that light. So you look at her words. She says, I hear and see examples of chaos almost every day. Little children are victims of senseless violence. That's her in 2017. Me in 1991, I say in my essay when I was 17 years old, perhaps the biggest problem the inner city faces is the deadly threat of violence. Same thing, but the similarities don't end there. 2017, Sandra says, we cannot continue to put responsibility on other people. It is our responsibility as future leaders. Myself, in 1991, I say mass initiative and moral responsibility must be put into effect. What should be done for the inner city residents must be done by inner city residents. So I came to see Sandra's like a kindred spirit. I came to see her as traveling the same path that I was traveling. And I consider Sandra Parks to be a martyr. And that's no light thing for me because my middle name is Shahid. And if you speak Arabic, you know that Shahid in Arabic means a martyr. The interesting thing about in Arabic, the word martyr, actually, it also means witness. And we know, well, think about what's the connection between a witness and a martyr. Well, why do we have witness protection programs? Sometimes if you're just a witness to something, you're likely to be killed because of what you've seen. So again, focusing on this AK-47, where did the gun come from? How did it end up on the streets of Milwaukee? Why is it important to know where a particular crime gun, we call these crime guns, guns that are used in the commission of a crime, where they came from? Why does it even matter? There's several good reasons. One, to reduce gun violence, right? You can't really fight gun violence if you don't know where the guns are coming from, right? You would think that if you are serious about trying to reduce gun violence, you want to know where are the weapons coming from. A lot of the times these days we talk about trauma, and that's important, but we also have to deal with the instruments of trauma. Because if we deal with the instruments of trauma, then we won't have some of the trauma that we're dealing with in the first place, right? Another reason, to hold the gun industry accountable. If you don't know if it turns out that a certain amount, a large amount of guns are coming from 1, 2, 3 particular stores, then we have to take a closer look at those stores to see if they're doing something wrong. Are they facilitating straw purchases? Do they have lax enforcement in place or lax practices in place when it comes to their sales? Another reason is to run a check on the system to see if the background check system is working. We don't know that. So this is Dylan Roof. This is a picture of Dylan Roof, the person who perpetrated the mass shooting at the church in South Carolina. So as you can see, and this is not me talking, this is the headline from a story. It says, FBI had the resources to halt Dylan Roof's gun buy, but it didn't use them, and it still doesn't. So Dylan Roof, before he perpetrated that massacre, he had a drug possession arrest that would have disqualified him from even purchasing a weapon. However, despite all the databases that the FBI had, there were all kinds of clerical errors and oversights and mistakes where he was still allowed to purchase the weapon. And we know as a result of those clerical errors, if in fact they were errors, oversights and different bureaucratic rules that enabled him to purchase a weapon, even though he wasn't supposed to have one, we lost 9 individuals who were simply at a church, including a state lawmaker from South Carolina who was basically assassinated, right? So that's the reason we have to know about the origin of guns. If we're not looking at where the guns are coming from, how they're being sold, were rules being followed or were rules being broken, if we don't have a good grasp on that, then how do we know we won't continue to see cases like this? From Dylan Roof himself, he says, I would like to make crystal clear, I do not regret what I did. I'm not sorry. I have not shed a tear for the innocent people that I killed, right? And he's able to do this because what? Because bureaucratic rules, mistakes, the background check system was basically broken and ineffective in this particular case. Another reason, just to honor the public's right to know, and we'll be getting into public records law in Wisconsin. And so what I hope to show today is that the city of Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Police Department, Congress, have all conspired to hide certain information about the Serbian-made AK-47 that was used to kill 13-year-old Sandra Parks. This local cover-up is part of a massive cover-up of the history and origin of guns used in shootings in cities throughout the United States. This cover-up is meant to protect the gun industry from getting sued for the violence that is taking place every day in the community. Sandra Parks was killed because of political hypocrisy at the national level and economic greed at the national and international level. So in order to end this cover-up, there's going to have to be one of several things. A change in law, and we'll get into what that law is, a change in the interpretation and application of the law, a challenge to the constitutionality of the law that actually requires the ATF to keep secret information that the agency has about guns that were used in crimes perpetrated throughout the United States, or activism, bold political leadership, and a willingness to defy the law. So let's think about this. Sandra won a contest named after Martin Luther King. And my thing is this: if we're going to celebrate Dr. King's life, then we have to celebrate his whole life. And as the pictures show up there, his life is not a life of just conforming to the law and just abiding by the law. Sometimes you have to break the law in order to get justice. And sometimes you'll pay a price for that. And this picture here shows Dr. King paid the ultimate price, just like Sandra paid the ultimate price. So if we're going to celebrate Dr. King, we can't do that halfway. We have to do that all the way. We can't just pick and choose what aspects of his life we want to celebrate. And just like with the case we're talking about today, we don't have time to get into the cover-ups with Dr. King's death, but we know there was a lot more to it than what's being said. And even Dr. King's family doesn't believe the official account of the assassination. I just put these books up just for future reference, but these all deal with cover-ups in the assassination of Dr. King. So what exactly is a cover-up? Let's just go to the dictionary for a minute. A cover-up is an attempt to prevent people's discovering the truth about a serious mistake or crime. So if I can show you that there's an attempt to prevent you all, the city, from discovering the truth about a serious mistake or crime that involved Sandra, then we're showing that there's a cover-up. Let's go to one more definition. A cover-up is usually a concerted effort to keep an illegal or unethical act or situation from being made public. So we need to see if that's the case here. So when people find out that I'm talking about this particular case, they say, oh, I hope they got the individual that did the shooting. And they did. He's sentenced to 50 years for his role in the shooting of Sandra Parks. His name is Isaac Barnes. But what I'm here to suggest is that this is about more than just the person who pulled the trigger, right? This is about who it is that supplied him with the weapon. So what I'm going to do right now, if I can, is I want to play an excerpt from an interview that I did with Mr. Barnes in trying to learn about the origin of the gun. If I can just get it up to, I'm going to turn this up as loud as I can. I was over there quite a bit so
you know a lot about my case.
Well, I mean, I followed it in the news, and the first thing that jumped out at me was when they said AK-47. I'm like, okay, well, how does an AK-47 end up in the streets like this? And so that's the main thing I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, see, it was a shortstop AK-47. It wasn't a fully loaded AK-47.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I got caught with two AK-47s, one fully loaded and one shortstop.
Mm-hmm. So what is like the purpose of even having something like that?
Like, I say like, cause we got a handgun, you can put an extra extended clip in the handgun. So instead of doing all of that, it's like you just shoot straight to a whole semi-automatic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I'm saying like it's like so much firepower, and it's almost like for warfare. Why would a person even feel like they need that much firepower?
Man, because it's a lot of things going on down in Milwaukee, and it's like, with one of those, you could just kill the whole situation.
Mm-hmm.
More bullets, more firepower in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how I see it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So that was the first excerpt from an interview, and I know that's difficult. I know it's difficult to listen to, and I apologize if that brings up some pain. I can't imagine what it's like, but I'm trying to shine light on this situation. And so one of the things I had to do was try to ask everybody involved, and sometimes we don't go straight to the source, and that's what I tried to do. There's one more excerpt from the interview that just kind of shines a little bit more light on what possibly was going on. If you can bear with me 1 second.
Weapons come from like a person like they out of town, you know what I'm saying? A person they getting them from gun shows, they getting them from out of gun shops. People they got tuned in with into gun shops, related to people, know people that's working at gun shops, and the gun shop people they take it out from their job and sell it to us on the streets for lower prices. Cause the price originally for the gun that I got caught with is range from $1,000 to $1,500 in a gun shop. So taking it from a gun shop to the streets is, you know what I'm saying, selling it for a lower price. So basically they come from like out of town gun shows and people that work at gun shops, and that's taking them from their job and starting a side business of their own from where they work, and they sell it to the streets. So mainly guns hit the streets because of people that's got more connections to them and resell them to the streets for lower prices.
Why would they take a loss like that? I don't understand the economics. If they can get $1,500 for it in the store, why take it to the streets?
I can't even answer that question for you.
So again, he alludes to, I tried to get him to say exactly what happened, but he said that he wanted to honor the street code, and that in the street code you just don't snitch. So he wouldn't name names or give many specific details, but he just spoke in generalities, as you heard there. And so the reason I play that is because he's providing insight, right? So we know that what he did is inexcusable, and he's going to be punished for that. But what I'm here to suggest is that as we try to find solutions to this particular problem, that it's going to have to involve, right, talking to the people who are actually involved or part of the problem. And if you want to know a bit about the background on how that interview was conducted, so, and actually, I don't mean to put her on the spot, but my daughter is here. Hadia, raise your hand for me. All right. So earlier this summer, I asked my daughter Hadia, I said, call the jail up and tell me, how do you do visits these days? And she said, well, you got to go to Home Wave. And I was like, Home Wave, what's that all about? So apparently there's this system where you can do video visits with inmates. And so I was actually I was glad that was an option, because I was planning to fly out here to interview Mr. Barnes about this incident, but I was able to actually do it at home. So you're wondering, how did I get that recording? It was through the Home Wave system. I just recorded it on my phone as he spoke. He said a lot more, but out of respect for the family and the fact that a lot of it is just not able to be corroborated, I won't play that. But the point is that, look, he clearly has information about the trafficking of guns on the streets, and maybe as he serves his 50-year sentence, maybe at some point we might learn more about it. So to get back to what we're here to do, is the question is not just who pulled the trigger, but who provided the gun that was used to kill Sandra Parks, right? And then there's another question, right? Did the Milwaukee Police Department even investigate the origin of the gun that was used to kill in this particular case? If they didn't look, right, wouldn't you consider that a problem? Because if look, it's one thing just to apprehend the shooter, the killer, but it's quite another to say, wait a minute, let's look at this systematically. Where are these guns coming from? And is there something we can do to stem the tide of violence, right? Was a federally licensed gun dealer involved? How did the gun that was used end up on the streets of Milwaukee? So what I did was I filed an open records request, and I filed this request back in December of last year, so about a month or so afterwards. And I think it's important to revisit what Wisconsin open records law says about how things are supposed to operate. So, and I'm just reading, this is just reading from state law. It says all persons are entitled to the greatest possible information. This is state law, right? This is state policy. It says further, providing persons with such information is declared to be an essential function of a representative government and an integral part of the routine duties of officers and employees whose responsibility it is to provide such information. This is their job. Their job is to provide us, the public, with information. And they say further, this is the law, presumption of complete public access, right? This is state law, complete public access, consistent with the conduct of governmental business. And it says further, the denial of public access generally is contrary to the public interest. So this is what the law says, right? We're supposed to be getting this information. So what I did was I wanted to know, hey, to the police department, I'm asking, what is your policy when it comes to performing a trace on a weapon? Can you send me the policy memo? Can you tell me, are you analyzing the information you get on guns that you run traces on? Do you have reports that are compiled as a result of, and I'm just trying to say, hey, are you running traces and are you analyzing the information to see where the guns come from? I will also ask for any correspondence between the Milwaukee Police Department and the Homicide Review Commission that concerns the traces of guns used in homicides in the city of Milwaukee. And then I ask for any records or reports that deal with the case of Sandra Parks, including but not limited to the trace of that particular gun. So the response I got from your police chief, Morales, was that my request was unreasonably burdensome. And he says it didn't meet the requirement for a reasonable limitation of time. So he's basically saying, because I didn't say what time I wanted these records from, oh, we might have to go all the way back to the 1800s to whenever. And it's like, come on, you know full well what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for policies that go back that far. Just tell me what the current policy is. And he says, because no time frame was specified, my staff would have to spend too much time. We would have to go back as far as our records have been retained. Those are his words. I have the letter here for you to review. He says, additionally, a firearms trace report is provided confidentially to the Milwaukee Police Department by the ATF. And he says that this trace report has been redacted from the responsive record. So he says there's a trace report, but he says basically we're not going to provide that as part of the record. He says the ATF gives us these trace reports for internal use only, on the condition that firearms trace reports remain the property of ATF and may not be redistributed outside of MPD. So he's saying, look, we have the trace. We're not going to give it to you. It's only for us to use for our purposes, but you can't have it. That's his conclusion. These are his words, right? And he says that the ATF wouldn't have given them the report unless they accepted those conditions, and unauthorized redisclosure by MPD would somehow mess up their relationship with the ATF. So he says, I have concluded, this is a quote, I have concluded effective investigation of crimes and effective law enforcement, which are furthered by honoring the conditions under which the ATF firearm trace report was provided to MPD, so as to protect the current and future joint law enforcement efforts of our agencies. He's saying that this interest outweighs any public interest in disclosure by MPD of the ATF firearms trace report itself or the name of the ATF agent involved. So he's saying, we're not going to tell you because we have these law enforcement interests, and that's greater than the public interest in this. And he says, lastly, all firearms trace records are maintained by the ATF. So he's kind of like saying, like, even if we had it, well, you got to ask them anyway. So we need to ask ourselves, is what the chief said, is that actually true? Is that actually how things go down when it comes to firearms trace information? And we'll see later, shortly, that there's actually a double standard. But first, I want to say a bit about why is it so hard to get gun trace information. So you have to be familiar with this case between the city of Chicago and the ATF. So we all know the city of Chicago, not far from here, right, 90 miles to the south, has a tremendous gun violence problem. So they actually sued the ATF for gun trace information. They wanted to know, hey, all these guns that are being used in Chicago, we want to know where are they coming from so we can better understand the problem. And so they actually won. They won the case not once, but they won it twice. The ATF was arguing that, look, these interstate gun carriers, their business would suffer if their businesses are associated with lost or stolen firearms. So in other words, if you deal in guns, but then it turns out a gun got stolen from your business, somehow that's going to hurt your business. So we have the ATF looking out for the interest of gun owners as opposed to looking out for the interests of the people. So the court initially ruled in favor of the city of Chicago and ordered the ATF to release the data to Chicago, not once, but twice. While that case was pending, Congress, your United States Congress, literally changed the law. And this is known as the TR Amendment. And they say that no trace information, right? So if you want information on a gun trace, it's not happening because they say, look, no trace information to anyone except police and prosecutors, strictly for criminal investigations, and then only as it pertains to the geographic jurisdiction of the law enforcement agency that's requesting it. So the only people that can even ask for this information now, based on Congress's new law that they passed after the ATF lost the case in Chicago, it only goes to police and prosecutors and only for an investigation. Now look at this part. It says trace information should not be used in any civil action or proceeding other than an action proceeding commenced by the ATF. So what are they saying? They're saying if you lose a loved one, you can't have that information to try and bring a lawsuit against the gun store that negligently sold the weapon that claimed your loved one. They say it's not for that. We're not providing the information for that. And so this is known as the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2005. And they say this is killer right here. They say gun trace data, quote, shall be immune from the judicial process. So now they're saying you can't even sue for this information. You can't even go to court and say, look, I believe there's some information about a gun that was used to kill my loved one. I want to see what it is. You can't even ask a court for it based on the way the law is written. Now you tell me, who was that law written for? Was that written for the people? Does that sound like that's written for the victims of gun violence? Or does that sound like that's a law that's written to protect the industry, the gun industry? And so the court, even though the court ruled in favor of the city of Chicago, after Congress passed that law, they vacated their prior rulings and ruled in favor of the ATF. And so if you want to know why is it so hard to get information on guns that were used in homicides and shootings and that are claiming our loved ones and wreaking havoc in the community, it's because Congress set it up that way. Now, here's the thing. Do they always go by that standard? What I discovered, and thanks to the help of a law firm that got involved with my case, and actually a representative from the law firm is here. His name is Daniel Narvi. Yeah. So Daniel's with Godfrey and Kahn. And so when I had trouble obtaining the records from the police department, I told Daniel about the case, and they looked into it, and it was just no time at all. They said, yes, we'll take this on. We agreed to help. And so Daniel brought to my attention this particular article. Daniel, perhaps you might I don't know if you might want to say a few words, but this was an article that shows how this retired officer who was shot, he was suing a gun store, right, that sold the weapon that was used to shoot him. So you have to wonder, well, how did he get the information? Didn't we just read where they say this information is not for lawsuits, right? That it's only for investigations. But here he is, this officer is pursuing a personal injury lawsuit. So how is it that the information somehow can be used for police officers who get shot? But then when young black children are shot, no, you can't have that information. We're going to protect the gun owners. We're going to protect the industry. You can't have this information. This has happened before, right? So there was a landmark lawsuit here in Wisconsin, right? When officers sued Badger Guns, and they won a $6 million verdict, $6 million, right? Because they found that there was some negligence on the part of Badger. They ended up settling for $1 million. But the case is at least they had access to the information and they had access to the courts. Whereas the law I just read is telling the rest of us that we don't have access to that information. So why is there a double standard? How come when the police get shot, we get this information about where the guns are coming from that they were wounded with, but for us, we can't get it. So this goes back actually to the former police chief, Edward Flynn, when he said he had a, quote, enough is enough moment back in 2009 after 2 Milwaukee police officers were shot. So 2 days after his enough is enough moment, the Milwaukee Police Department began to stake out Badger Guns, which was the gun shop that sold the gun that was used to kill the officers in that particular case back in 2009. And here's an article where this is them staking out Badger Guns. So my question is this: are the police the only ones who get to say enough is enough? How come the police can get trace information and sue stores when they get shot, but the rest of us can't? How come mothers such as Bernice Parks can't say enough is enough? Did the Milwaukee Police Department do any stakeouts or similar efforts after Sandra was killed? I didn't see any news stories like that. So Godfrey and Khan got in. Daniel, perhaps you just say a bit about why the firm decided to take the case. And
so I just wanted to assist in a small way if I could. And so we were able to jump in pretty soon after Jamaal had emailed me.
Working in this case, as a freelancer, I was tremendously grateful to have a law firm involved, because when I was a reporter at the Journal-Sentinel, we had in-house lawyers who would help with these types of things. But if you're just a regular journalist, right, you don't have access to especially as a freelancer, you don't have access to the money or the legal representation. So I was tremendously grateful for your law firm getting involved and helping with this particular case. So we filed a response that basically said, hey, we believe that we're entitled to this information, that you can't create exceptions for certain records and then exempt it from Wisconsin's public records law. If you have a record, then we're entitled to it. After the law firm got involved, Milwaukee Police Department, now all of a sudden they denied that there was ever a trace report. They said, and I'm quoting from their letter, whereas initial response made reference to a trace report, they changed the story and it says, quote, MPD does not have a copy of a trace report associated with the homicide of Ms. Parks. So first they refer to it, now they say, well, we don't have it. He says, accordingly, the extent to which you are asking for a specific trace report, MPD has no responsive record. All right, but so after I got the law firm involved, Milwaukee Police did finally release some information, but not the key information that I was looking for. But let's look at what we were able to get. So this is an actual page from the report that was provided. And I've typed it up so that we can see it a little bit better. I know it's a little bit unclear, but I'll do my best to read to you. So the gun that was used in the death of Sandra Parks, our beloved warrior sister, May she rest in power. It was made by a firm called Zastava, which is located in Serbia. The model is a PAP M92PV. The caliber is 7.62 by 39 millimeters. There's a serial number there, MA2, P is in Paul, V is in Victor, 060327. Let me read that serial number again, and I'm going to tell you why. M as in money, A as in apple, 2, P is in Paul, V is in victory, 060327. If there's anyone in the law enforcement community who somehow has access to this trace information, we would be extremely grateful for it. And if somehow that could be provided, we would be extremely grateful. We know someone out there knows the magnitude of what's at stake and has access to this and is able to provide it. I'm not hard to find. I'm DC Writer 360. That's DCWRITER 360 on Twitter. And all my contact information is there. And if you can provide credible information for it, we would greatly appreciate it. It was a rifle, semi-automatic, and it was imported by a company called Century Arms International. So this is a picture of the type of gun that it was. As you can see on this particular site, it's sold out. It's a popular weapon. So what do we know about this company called Zastava? So it's a leading defense manufacturer in Serbia. And it's millions of dollars in debt. So think about that for a minute. Here's a company that is millions of dollars in debt. Just hold that thought for a minute. And here's the article that I actually had to get this translated. Google is miraculous. The original article was written in a language I didn't understand. This was the citation for the fact that this particular company is in debt. But through Google Translator, I was able to get it translated and see what was going on with the company. This company, Zastava, its weapons were used in the Paris attacks. So think about that, the terrorism that we saw in Paris, and everybody all of a sudden they had a French flag because they identified with that. It came from this particular weapon, from this particular weapon manufacturer, Zastava. So think about that. A weapon made in Serbia ends up on the streets of Milwaukee. How? They say that the gun that was used in the Paris attack came through the US. What do we know about this company called Century Arms International? So Zastava is the company that made it. Century Arms International is the company that imported it. So here's a headline from a few years ago. It says, in Franklin County, this is out in Vermont, the state of Vermont, global arms dealer quietly makes a killing. And they're referring to the economics of it, right? So this company is located in Vermont. Who would ever thought that a company in Vermont, what they're doing, would somehow cause a tragedy or lead to and enable a tragedy on the streets of Milwaukee? So this particular, they manufacture and import a huge volume of military-style assault weapons and other firearms. In 2005, the company produced this 2,657 rifles, but in 2009, the year President Barack Obama was first inaugurated, Century manufactured 42,876 guns, right? So you can see the politics. You remember when there was the controversy over people felt Obama was going to snatch their weapons. So people they wanted to get armed up. And so they had huge orders, huge volume of orders after Obama got elected. According to data collected by the ATF, Century Arms manufactured 453,016 guns in the decade ending with 2017. So you think about all those guns on the street, right? After talk about outlawing assault weapons in the wake of Sandy Hook, You know, the massacre, the school massacre where those first graders were slaughtered, right? The company got unprecedented order volume. This company's weapons have found their way to Nicaraguan Contras, Mexican drug cartels, and American mass shooters. The company's guns, or that of its Romanian supplier to another, they've been connected to 5 mass shootings since 2007. Despite all the carnage, right, and this I'm just quoting from an article that's been written, Vermont politicians have continued to go to bat for the company, pointing to the more than 100 people that it employs at a manufacturing plant in the town of Georgia. So despite the fact that all these guns they make end up in Mexican drug cartels and they're being used in mass shootings, what do they care about? 100 people got jobs. Think about that. It's about money. So state legislators in Vermont allowed the company to continue importing, manufacturing, and exporting high-capacity magazines, even as they prohibited their sale within Vermont. So here it is, they let a company make something that they don't even want in Vermont. It's banned in Vermont, but they say they can make it and export it elsewhere. And even one of the state lawmakers in Vermont, he said, this is a quote, he says, "It seems hypocritical to me." So initially I said what? I was going to prove political hypocrisy. I don't have to prove it. It's coming straight from the politician's mouth. He says, why would we ban something and then allow it to be made here? Despite his concerns, this lawmaker and 122 others, Democrats, Republicans, and progressives alike, they voted for the loophole that enabled the company to continue to make things that were actually banned in Vermont. And so this lawmaker, in explaining it, they said, well, why did you do it? He said, I supported it with reservations because I didn't want to harm a local business. It's about money. He says, but even I found, this is a quote, he says, but I found even my vote to be a hypocritical one. I own that. So I don't have to make the case. The politician himself is telling you. And here's the article in which it was, Century Armed, Vermont importers guns used in mass shootings, right? So the shooting at the Garlic Festival, that came from, that's tied to Century International Arms. The Walmart shooting, that also was believed to have been tied to them, right? So one interesting thing is that even though Century Arms imported that Zastava weapon that was used here in the tragedy, Sandra Parks, is that we don't have to worry about Century importing any more weapons made by Zastava. Unfortunately, that's not a good development, and I'll tell you why. The reason is because Zastava is set up in the United States now. They want to cut out the middleman. So now they're located in Illinois. So now the weapons that they were making, they're not going through Century Arms anymore. They're here in the United States. Here's the article. And I'll gladly provide all these slides for you. So what we see throughout is what? Economic concerns trumping concerns of people's well-being. People are concerned about, oh, I don't want to hurt a business. I don't want to hurt jobs. But meanwhile, young children like Sandra are losing their lives because these people are allowed to make devices of human destruction that even they don't want in their own backyard. But we have to deal with it on 13th and Center. So at some point you might wonder, well, what do we do about this? So one of the things I want to guard against is, again, we can't just fall into this trap where we just list all the tragedies that took place in Milwaukee and we put teddy bear memorials up and we have the vigils. I know we have to do that because it's therapeutic and we have to mourn those who are gone, but at some point we have to become more systematic about how it is that we fight this particular problem. So one thing I would like to recommend, and I hope there are some politicians with the will to explore this, but to establish a crime gun registry so that all the guns that are used in homicides and shootings in the city of Milwaukee should be put into a registry, and we should get reports on those weapons, where they came from, so that we can have a better understanding of where they're coming from and how we might be able to stop it. I'm not asking for nothing the police department doesn't get for their own. As we've seen, they sue when they get shot, they get the information. When they get shot, how come we can't have it? So the gun registry that I'm calling for is actually the state of New York is trying to do something like this. So if you want to look it up, thank you so much. If you want to look it up, there's a senator in New York. His name is Michael Gianaris, and he passed, the Senate passed legislation mandating that the Department of Criminal Justice, this is in New York, establish a database tracking the state and county of origin guns used in New York. So in other words, they just want to know, where are these guns coming from? And I submit to you that we ought to do something like that in Milwaukee. I think that we should include more information about guns that are used in homicides in Milwaukee in the annual reports that are put out by the Milwaukee Homicide Review Commission. Now, when you read the reports, the current reports by the Milwaukee Homicide Review Commission, they got all kinds of data. They got, was the person shot in the daytime or nighttime? Were they shot in the torso or the legs? Things of that, were they shot in 53212 or 53210? All this information. What's the one thing they don't have? Where the guns came from. So if you're going to be doing reviews of homicides, don't you think that you ought to be looking at where the guns that are being used in homicides are coming from? Doesn't that seem like a reasonable thing to do? There's a document known as the Blueprint for Peace. I think it should be revised. So here, this is a copy of it. You can look it up. The Blueprint for Peace, and I'm not criticizing it, but one of the elements of the Blueprint for Peace says that an objective is to decrease illegal gun availability and to conduct dialogue and education to promote evidence-informed policies related to gun ownership and possession. That's great. But how can you really have an informed dialogue and evidence-informed policies if you don't know where the guns are coming from? So what I would propose is that this blueprint, similar to the gun registry that I recommended, the Blueprint for Peace should have something similar in it. And they should produce quarterly reports on the history and origin of guns used in shootings in the city of Milwaukee. I think, now I'm a proud Panther, and I told you, me and Mike, we went to UWM at the same time. I guess you could call us Black Panthers if that's the case. But I'm proud. I'm proud to have attended and graduated from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. But I do believe my beloved alma mater could do more to confront and understand gun violence in the city of Milwaukee. So what I would like to see is a gun research project designed specifically to learn more about the history and origin of guns used to perpetrate shootings in the city of Milwaukee. We ought to have, look, UWM is a Research 1 institution. That means it's a top research institution. But that distinction doesn't mean anything if it's just going to be on the edge of Shorewood, not concerned with what's happening. And I'm not saying that it is, because they have done some research on gun violence. But I'm saying specifically, there needs to be research done by UWM on the history and origin of guns that are used to perpetrate shootings in the city of Milwaukee. I think this project should be part of UWM's undergraduate research program. And I say undergraduate for a reason. A lot of times when you go to college, you don't do real research until you're a graduate. UWM is progressive. They actually have undergrads involved in doing research. And this has been shown that when it comes to increasing graduation, you're more likely to graduate if you're involved in serious research as an undergrad. So I think that undergraduates, especially from Milwaukee, should be part of this project. So one of the things I'm recommending is that special efforts should be made to create scholarships at UWM to recruit Milwaukee students who live in zip codes disproportionately affected by gun violence, right? Because who better to study that problem than those affected by it? And I think that the research could be expanded into other things. You know, we have things like ShotSpotter, you know, which is a detection system that goes off when it hears gunshots. Why not get students involved with understanding how that works and maybe trying to improve it? I think there should be a scholarship established in the name of Sandra Parks for people to study at UWM, to study gun violence at UWM. To this end, I pledge $1,000 if $50,000 can be generated from other sources. Let me make that clear. If we can raise $50,000, I pledge $1,000 to establish a scholarship named after Sandra Parks so that a student can go to UWM and study this problem. I'm on record with that. 50 more people, I need you to step up. Again, we can't focus on trauma without focusing on the tools of trauma. We need to repeal the TR amendment. This is the amendment that makes it illegal for the ATF to release firearms trace information, right? So, and it's been shown that since this amendment has been in place, it's just been tremendously, it's been impossible to get information on guns. But it's actually, it's had a negative effect. So it's actually increased gun sales to criminals. And these are stats. So there's been efforts to repeal the TR amendment before, but they've all failed. So in terms of what can be done at the policy level, I think that's something that ought to be pursued so that we can get more information about where these guns are coming from instead of being hamstrung by a Congress that is doing the bidding of the gun industry. I think we should basically change the law or break the law. This is not a law that we can afford to abide by anymore, right? If they're gonna make it illegal for us to know where guns are coming from, how they're ending up in. So of all the information that Milwaukee police did provide, what's missing? We don't have, did they end up at a Wisconsin gun store? Because it had to travel, if it went from Serbia to Vermont, somehow it ended up in Milwaukee. Was a local gun store involved? Was there a straw purchase? Was the gun stolen? These are all unanswered questions. But these are the questions that we need to ask, not only in the case that we're discussing today, but anyone who loses their life or gets hurt by gun violence in the city of Milwaukee. And we have to remember this too. We have to remember Sandra Parks and all that we do. If I had my way, I would. A street should be named after her, so that we never forget. Look, she was at home. At home. So think about that, especially when it comes time to do what has to be done, whether it's protest. And I'm not saying protest. I didn't really recommend that, but at some point, it might have to go that route. But don't let fear of what might happen overcome you, because look, whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And we see Sandra Parks as a martyr. She's a witness to that. There's nothing we can do to escape it. So what I'm saying is we have to do something, right? Or else this problem is going to continue to claim our loved ones, even as they're in the sanctity of their own homes. Thank you for your attention.